Well, just just give me some type of a cue for, okay, Bob, start the video at this point, and I'll just edit everything out before it because I can just delete it later.
Okay.
So we're good. But whenever you want to start, we're gonna leave the doors open for now.
Okay.
Until I get the guys over here to turn the AC down.
Sure.
So at least we have some flow through.
All right.
All right.
So far? Good. I'm curious from an audience perspective what everyone's general role is. Is it mostly like you call yourself QA or tester or something like that? Any developers? Any managers? Okay. So just to get started, the talks about behavior-driven development, that's kind of a phrase that's become popular in the last, I don't know, say 2 or 3 years. Is anyone maybe experimenting with this or trying it out, or has you done some form of this before? Yeah. Okay, so just a quick introduction. My name is Clayton Linglesegich. I work for a company called integrumtech.com. I've got a blog, Clayton LZ, where I write some stuff. You can find me on Twitter there. If you have any questions after the fact, a week from now, you get stuck and you want to ask a question, you can hit me up on Twitter or email me or do something. All right, so does anyone have a perception of maybe what BDD is? Everyone's new to BDD, maybe? So BDD, behavior-driven development. So like I said, it's been something that's been going on for a couple years. I forgot. Bob, you can start the video now. It's been going on for a few years now. It's something that was kind of coined. There's a guy named Dan North who talked about this a lot. And his general thing was, there's a lot of different ways to do testing, lots of different testing frameworks. People talk about tools, and maybe there's a better way to talk about how we're going to solve these problems. And so we kind of coined the term BDD, and it started out with the idea that when people talk about testing, they talk about tests. And when you write a unit test, as a developer, you start the class's name, test something, the methods are named test this. And he was thinking more in terms of what should something do? Like what is the behavior of this thing that we're supposed to be building? And so for me, there's 3 big components to BDD. And the first one is that it's a conversation. So here's a picture of these 3 guys, and they're just talking. And I think that's the first part of BDD. It's really sitting down with, maybe if you're on a Scrum team, a product owner, or maybe your team has a business analyst. Maybe you have who knows what, right? There's somebody that maybe it knows how the system is supposed to work. And when they add a new feature to that system, they want to add a new feature, it's for some reason. And so it really starts out with talking about what that is. How do we come to terms with, or how do we get here? How do we know this is what we want? How's it supposed to behave? That kind of stuff. And it's really just discussing this thing. So that's, to me, the first part of BDD. The second part, the really important thing, is this aspect of discovery. So, has anyone here ever heard of the concept of second-order ignorance? You have things you don't know. Like, I don't know this, and then there's things that I don't know that I don't know, right? And so those are the ones that usually bite us when we are developing software. Like the bug that comes in after the fact when we thought we had everything perfect, and then there was this thing that we never even considered happening, like the weird issue. And so BDD purposefully discovering things about a feature or a defect or some part of the system that otherwise, like with your normal workflow or your normal kind of way of doing things, you can maybe just kind of gloss over. You know, you make an assumption in your head, you don't really even realize that you're assuming something about how the system works. There are things that you think are true, but you never really ask yourself how you know those things are true, but you just go along with your day as if they were. And so BDD is really about discovering things. And then the other big part for me is the concept of shared language. So has anyone ever seen this map? It's about different words for soda. So I say soda because I grew up in Southern California. So all the yellow parts people call, if I had a can of Coca-Cola Classic, I would call it soda because I grew up here. And I lived here in Maricopa County for a long time, so we still call it soda. But is anyone here from like Minnesota or anywhere in the Midwest? Do you call it pop? Right? If you live in the South, you call it Coke. And there's some people, you can't tell it's green, but you can't really tell on the projector. But there are these little pockets where there's some other word for this thing. But it's all the same thing, right? And so, actually just the other day, I was working with a team, and they were talking about the concept of groups. And so, the developers are saying, whatever, I can't remember the exact context. There's these people in the system, and they get put in groups. Now, the developers understood that group was like a fake thing. It wasn't actually, it didn't exist. It was just a name that they had come up with to describe this thing of people grouped together. So that kind of makes sense. That's a group. But the product owner and some people on this side of the fence, when they heard group, they thought it was a thing. Like, it had a name, and it had properties, and whatever. You could edit it and all that stuff. So the whole time they're talking about the same thing. I'm saying group, you're saying group. But they mean something totally different. Right? So it's kind of like this, the opposite. You know, we mean the same thing here, but we're using two different words. And I see that a lot, too. People will talk about the system, some aspect of the system, where I will say, maybe I say user, and the people on the product side say customer or something, or person. And we're talking about the same thing, but we use these two different words. So a big part of BDD is shared language. And as you start doing this deliberate discovery process, and you start kind of going through the mechanics of talking about your features this way, you will start finding that there are certain words and certain ways of describing things that become like institutionalized. And a big one I see this a lot is people have, I would guess, does anyone here work in a really small company? How many people, like 14? Okay. Even small companies, but people that work in big companies usually have big complex systems that have existed for a really long time, and they're very confusing. Now, there are some people that know a whole lot about the domain, and they can explain all the little details, but most of the time, people have to talk about certain contexts, and they have to do a bunch of setup. So they have to say things like, okay, well, let's say that you're an administrator, but you're an administrator for this certain kind of special site. Oh, and that special site also has this, and there's all this build-up, right? Before they can even talk about what they want to talk about, they have to do all this setup. And so when you talk about shared language, when you get into shared language, you start coming up with words for these things, and some people even come up with metaphors. So a good example is when extreme programming was starting out in Chrysler when they were building their HR system, they agreed that they weren't going to talk about things in HR terms. They were only going to use a metaphor. And so what they chose was, the HR system was kind of like a packing factory, right? So money comes in from somewhere, like on a truck. So they would say, okay, let's say the truck comes in and it has all the M&Ms on it. And when we're going to assemble a person's paycheck, that's kind of like a box, and we're going to put M&Ms in it, right? So that's like their money. But as it goes down the assembly line, when it gets to the part where they pay their health insurance deduction, we're going to take some M&Ms out. And when it gets to the part where there's a bonus, if there is a bonus, we might put some more M&Ms back in. And so they talked about the whole system using the shared language of this metaphor for like a packing plan. And over time, they would get to a point where they never had to talk about anything with HR, paychecks for people, or benefits, or vacation, or anything like that. It was all just some metaphor that had to do with the system. And that was kind of like a shared language thing. Okay, so here's another TDD. Is anyone practicing TDD, test-driven development? Anyone on our team doing it? Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about how these things differ. this red-green refactor, something you might have heard before. You know, I write this little teeny failing test. I write just enough code to make it pass. I go refactor, that kind of thing. It differs from BDD in that it's really focused on testing. It is about testing, test-driven development. Behavior-driven development is about BDD. Now, you can kind of mix the two, because you could write your unit tests, and you could be describing the behavior if you wanted to. But they're separate things. You don't get into discovery or shared language or deliberate discovery, anything like that with TDD. All right, what about ATDD, acceptance test-driven development? Has anyone ever tried this before? Another word for it is specification by example. So this one is like, I feel like this is where most people go when they try and do BDD, they end up here. And so you start talking about the specification and how the system should behave and those kind of things, but it's still very focused on tests. You're very focused on getting to a certain context and like asserting that something is the way it is after the fact. And that's not so much what BDD is about, but definitely what a specification by example or acceptance test-driven development is. Now there's a whole bunch of DDs out there. There's domain-driven design. I covered a few of them. And there's a bunch of stuff out there. People are, you know, we're going to drive our design using blah. And BDD to some degree is the same way. But BDD, compared to the other ones about design, is really not about the tools. All the other DD things are usually about a certain tool, or testing specifically, or automation, or something like that. But BDD, you don't need any of that stuff. You can still do it. All right, so we're going to get into this exercise now. It's called the Deliberate Discovery Workshop. It's something that I actually just learned about not too long ago, and I've tried it before, but this is the first time I've tried it with a group of people that I haven't been working with, so it should be interesting to see what happens. I'm going to pause that for a second. Okay, so let's break up into, let's do like 3 and 4. We can just divide the room in half. And we'll give everyone a piece of paper here. Maybe some markers as well. And you're going to want to divide the piece of paper into fourths. And you're going to kind of work with the people in your group as you go, but each person's going to kind of do this individually. But you can certainly discuss and whatnot. And let's see. Yeah, perfect number of pens. So we're going to divide the paper in fourths. And then the first thing, at the kind of the top of the paper, somewhere kind of big, you're going to write the title of it. And basically what we're going to try to do is tell a story. And so it's something that you might end up doing in like a planning meeting or planning exercise. But the first thing we want to do is we want to talk about some problem that you had in some aspect of your work related to the thing you were building or the team was building. And something that you came across that ended up being a problem that, you know, maybe you feel like could have been avoided or caused some issue with how the software was built or something like that. So take a few minutes and think about that. And you're going to write that in one of your first quadrant, your quarter paper. Could you restate that again? Yeah, so think of some problem that either you had or the team had in kind of the context of the thing you were building. So it could have been like a defect happened, or you implemented a feature that was wrong, you know, and those kind of things. Okay. And once you've written that down, take a moment, go through your group, and kind of discuss what you wrote down with the other people in your group. So now I want you to think about, like, what was the, like, at what point did some commitment get made that said you would get this thing done the right way? So it could have been, maybe if you did sprint planning, that you did your planning meeting and you said we're going to get all this work done, so you made the commitment. It could have been that, you know, the CEO talked to his CEO friend and then came to you and said, you have to get this feature done tomorrow, like, we have to have it done. There's all kinds of reasons, you know, you made a promise, someone made a promise on your behalf, whatever. So in the next column or the next kind of section, write down what it was, like, when did you commit to this thing?
Are we talking about before the feature failed, before the issue?
Right. Yeah, when did you commit to doing it the right way?
Originally.
Right, exactly.
Or do you mean after, when you needed to commit to fixing it?
No, I mean originally.
Okay.
So when you, no one obviously set out to get it wrong. So think about when you committed to doing it the right way. And in that same column, I want you to think about what it was about the situation that made it hard to recover. So you made a commitment at some point in time, but then something went wrong, and you know, maybe you couldn't recover in time. You couldn't get it right when maybe the commitment said you were going to have it right. So like, think about what point in time it was, you know, too far gone. You couldn't go back and make it right. And then like to share what they put in the second column. Did everyone here make the commitment, or did someone make the commitment for you? Team did? Okay.
Yeah.
Was there anyone that had someone else kind of make the commitment on their behalf? Make a promise to someone else and you had to fulfill it? Yeah. Okay.
Been in that situation before, for sure.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure everyone's been in the situation of someone else made a promise and you have to do the work. Okay, so now in the third column, I want you, this is kind of the deliberate discovery part. I want you to like, think about what information you could have had that would have prevented this problem. So maybe there was a conversation with a certain person that in the organization you didn't have in time. Maybe there were some missing details that you just didn't know about. Maybe there was another part of the organization, or you were reliant on some other person that you thought they were going to be able to deliver at a certain time, but it turns out they couldn't. So think about what it was, you know, what information could you have got, could you have had, what conversations could you have had that could have prevented this.
previous release.
Yeah.
And then we release it back again.
Okay.
Add it into it's just not working. And finally, at the end, they decide to drop that because they send in their add-on too late at the release time.
Okay.
So I think we should include that earlier.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Anything else?
I wrote down a better understanding of an issue or a defect as it's discovered in the field rather than how it's reported to the team. Because sometimes there's a discrepancy.
So more information about the specific defect in the field, not necessarily like what it looks like after it goes through the triage process.
Correct.
Okay, so in the fourth one, I want you to, in the fourth column, think about what are some ways what are like some options you might have had where you could have either delayed the commitment or not promised specifically what you did, but promised part of it or something like that. What are some ways that you could have solved the problem by keeping your options open? Right? Because a lot of times we make a commitment to do something a certain way, and at the end of some time period, maybe the end of the sprint, whatever you want to call it, it's not done. But we could have had an opportunity maybe to maybe keep our options open a little bit more. You know, maybe if we found out that the third party wasn't going to deliver the thing, we could have had the option to not include it. We might have known about that the day before the release, for instance. So think about something. What are some ways you could have kept your options open so that it wouldn't have been a problem where you made a commitment and you missed it? Nope. Hey. Right, you know. It's nothing time.
They're just supposed to sneak in.
So did anyone feel that maybe they made their commitment too early? You committed to doing something before maybe had all the information. What was your example?
I was just saying that from the features, et cetera, we just kind of look at the story points and say, oh, yeah, team can do about this, but really haven't done the conversation and the investigation and the detailing out a little bit.
Okay. So you didn't have a complete picture. You still committed to it anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what we did.
It's pretty common. Anyone else?
Yes, try.
Limit the features so that small parts can be removed or modified instead of having to scrap the entire.
So maybe like instead of having one big feature, lots of little small features, kind of. Okay. Anything else? So in going through this kind of process and thinking about this, whatever that problem was that you wrote down in the first box, did anyone have any kind of insights or anything interesting that they learned maybe they hadn't thought about before for this particular issue? Was anyone surprised by kind of now that you take a step back and look at all the stuff and the thought process you took? Did you surprise yourself with anything that you wrote down? How likely do you think you are that a similar problem will come up in the future? Very likely. Is there anything that you wrote down that you think might be able to prevent that from happening in the future? Or is it just inevitable you're going to have that problem again?
Well, I think by nature, the more times we run into scenarios like this, the better we understand how to recognize them sooner.
Right.
So just experience.
So you mentioned that you had the kind of database problem. Sounds like it was So as people that are in like the QA team or QA department or however it works in your organization, how many of you are involved in the planning meeting? Like, what's your typical role in the Scrum planning? Is it mostly the developers talking? Is it equal? Mostly developers.
And ours is mostly probably we're going over the requirements with developers.
Okay.
We ask questions, about stuff that they might not think of
Okay.
from the customer standpoint. So.
And then from as far as the development stuff is concerned, is it typically the developers go work on the stories and they write the code and they do whatever they do, and then they hand it to you guys, and then you have to do whatever your test plan is? Is that pretty typical? Okay. So one thing that I'm a big advocate of is I really don't like the idea that, especially on a Scrum team, or on any team really, that the QA people are treated like kind of second-class citizens where you just get handed the junk. And I don't think anyone on the development side of the fence does that like on purpose. I think that's just most company cultures are that way. And I'm kind of a big believer in shifting everyone to the left, depending on how you look at it. So right now, in most organizations, the kind of typical thing is the product owner goes on and on about the stories. They tell the developers say, yeah, we understand it. Usually the people that are writing the test plans or doing any kind of testing don't really have a big say in how the feature gets implemented or how they're going to test it or how to test the system. There's all these different questions. And I feel like people that have been doing QA for a long time have like a totally different mindset of how they think about the problems that developers do. And so I would personally like to see when people that are more in a traditional QA role are a little bit ahead of the developers. So they're talking more about the features in terms of testing, and especially with BDD, talking about like scenarios and behaviors. And then it's more of a collaborative effort with the developers. So there's a few questions that I have a development background, but I've never worked in an organization that had a QA department. I've always had to do that myself. And so there are a few questions that I've kind of come up with that I've found to be very helpful that I think can apply to anyone on the team, but specifically I think the people that are more in the testing world have a better kind of mindset for this. So the one thing I always ask is, what's the context? So can someone give me an example of a feature that their team has developed recently? We'll just use that example going forward. I can make one up too if no one has one.
Like a feature.
Yeah.
Like, let's say moving the database from one place to another place.
Is that like something that the user is doing, or is that like the
User,
team?
we let the user the ability to move the database already. We sell software and they like CRM application, and then they create their own database, and later they say,
Oh, okay.
you know what, I need to move this database from this folder to another folder, or I need to move the database from one computer to another computer because I just purchased a new computer.
Okay. So let's say that we'll have to get away from user story. As a user, I should go and move my customer database from one computer to the other. So I think if you were to ask this question to a developer, the first thing they go to is like technical stuff, like okay, what kind of database is it? Like is the file system, blah blah blah. But I always want to wonder like, what's the context? And so I think you got into it a little bit there. You said, I got a new computer or something, or whatever. I have data already in there. So this feature doesn't seem like it would be very useful for someone who just started the application. But it sounds like if they had started and now they realize that it should be on like a bigger hard drive or something like that. So I always want to know what's like what are all the surrounding things that got me to wanting this feature, and how, if I put myself in the user shoes, and I always like to use the word I, and I'm describing it, I pretend like I'm a user. But how did I get here? And so that's kind of where the next thing after context comes. How did I get to the point where I would like even want to use this, or even use this feature? And so I think a perfect scenario, kind of talking about the behavior of the system, is I started using this application, and I've put in 1,000 customers that I have in my Rolodex or whatever, and I'm realizing that I want to maybe share this with the rest of the people in my company, so I'm going to put it on the network drive or who knows what, right? So that's kind of like, if you think about the user, there's probably 5 or 6 different ways they can get to a point where they would actually want to use the feature. But in asking this question, you can start doing some of that deliberate discovery and trying to figure out how is the user going to interact with this thing, and how does it behave with the rest of the system. And you can even get more specific. You know, if it's a, say, web application, you can say, like, how did the user get to this screen? You know, if they want to be able to transfer the database from one place to the other, like, where do they go in the application to do that? And a lot of times you'll find people on the product side, especially if they're getting their feedback from customers and the customer says, I want this feature, they haven't even really thought about that stuff. It's like, I just want them to be able to transfer the database. Like, don't you get that? You know, it's like, well, how do they even do that? Like, is there a totally new screen? Is that somewhere in the menu? You know, do they have to go to a special place? So, if you think about it in terms of the users kind of on a journey, right? Their journey includes this feature that you're building. Like, how did they get there? You know, did they? If I say I'm gonna go to Disneyland, and that's my feature, I want to go have fun at Disneyland. Do I like go to the airport, fly, do I get a cab, do I drive? There's all different ways, but you have to figure out how they got there. And another one I always ask is, why do I want this? Like, why does, as a user, why would I even want to do this thing? I think this one's very important because a lot of times you'll find that the product person says, well, someone said they wanted this, right? Well, that's not usually good enough. Like, what are they trying to solve? You know, what thing are they trying to do? Like, why do I even want to do this? A lot of times you'll find that the customer thinks they want something, but they want something totally different. And I think those are the kind of questions that people with a QA background, because they spend so much time in the whole application and not isolated in one little thing, they think of those kind of questions. They can think in that mindset. I like this one too. Where do I go from here? This one, so my favorite example of this, I was working on an application where the user got to upload their, like, an avatar photo, and they could crop it, and they can do all this stuff. And the idea was, obviously, right, it sounds so obvious, that you would upload this picture and it would go on your profile page. And the way the feature ended up getting implemented, because no one ever asked this question, was you uploaded your picture and you did all this fancy cropping and it was this really slick interface, and then you press the submit button and it just took you to the home page. So it's like, who made that decision? Like, obviously some developer realized they didn't know the answer to this question, so they just guessed. And I think it got filed as like a defect, but I don't know, was it really a defect? No one ever asked. Like, no one ever said it should go anywhere else. And I found this to be probably one of the most helpful ones, is especially in a web application. But after I complete some operation and I use this new feature that we're building, like, what happens next? Do I see something? Do I see a, you know, indicator that says it worked? Do I go, what screen do I see after this? All that kind of stuff. This is really talking about the behavior, right? How does the system behave? When I get it right, what do I do? When I get it wrong, what happens? So here's another one. This is like edge case stuff. What if there's a problem? A lot of times you hear people talking about the happy path. So I've heard that phrase before. Right, so developers operate usually in the happy path. They go through and they fill out the form exactly like they should, and they never make any mistakes, and ta-da, the feature works, and that's what they demo. But there's a lot of times where stuff goes wrong and people don't use the system the way that maybe the developer thought they should use the system. And it doesn't quite work. And that's where I think we use a lot of defects.
Oh, yeah.
So. Now, with behavior-driven development, you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty about every single possibility. So let's go use our form example. If I have a form where you have to fill out your address, maybe your address and your phone number or something, maybe there are rules about I need your zip code, but I don't need the +4. I need your phone number, and I don't really care if you separate it or if you put special characters in there or whatever. So there's always little rules about that. And with behavior-driven development, you don't have to get into all the details about that. You really just want to describe at a little bit higher level. You know, when the form's filled out correctly, what should happen? When there's an error on the form, what should happen? And you can worry about testing those little more validation kind of things at some lower level. But if you try and get into too much of that at this level, at the behavior level, you'll end up with these really complex scenarios. We're talking about those a little bit more. And this one, I think, is what a lot of more experienced QA people I've found bring to the table. because developers usually get very excited about the code itself and the feature or whatever in the implementation, they don't really stop to ask the question of, like, is this even expected behavior in the system? And now, sure, there's sometimes you're going to add a new feature that's a new feature and no one's ever seen it before, but if everything in the system works a certain way and the user's used to things working a certain way, and then you get to a point where something works differently, like that's just confusing, and it doesn't really fit, it's not consistent. So I was trying to ask this question. Let's say that we got through everything, all the other questions, and we think, hey, those are, make sense, and I know where I'm supposed to go, I know how to get there, I know what happens afterwards. But would the user ever expect this to happen? And it's not to say that if the user is unexpected, that means it's bad, but it's just something to think about. Those are the kind of things that you get defects for, or people get confused, or you get extra documentation, or you get more support calls, or whatever. And this is kind of an opportunity to catch that before you even work on a feature. So we've talked a lot about these kind of questions, and what you end up with in BDD is this concept of scenarios. And they use the syntax given when then. Has anyone ever seen that before? So I've got a couple examples here. So we have this first scenario. Generate a report for my division. Given I'm a division manager, when I generate a report for my division, I should see data specific to my division. And maybe if I'm a site manager, when I generate a report for my site, I get data for all divisions. So these are like just basic scenarios, but they describe the behavior of the system. And the idea here is that this is something that you can either write collaboratively with people on the product side, or you could show to the product person and they would read this and say, yeah, that's how the system should behave. And the other nice thing is that if you get this kind of list of scenarios, maybe when you get a support call and someone calls in and says, hey, I'm a site manager and I tried to generate a report for my site, but I'm not seeing all the data for all my divisions. Someone could go to this and say, well, that's how it should work, so that's a defect. Or maybe someone says, hey, I'm a division manager, I tried to generate a report for my division, but I can only see my division. Like, I thought I would see stuff from someone else. Well, no, that's not how the system works, right? So we use this given when then. And so if you go back to kind of the questions, the given's kind of the context. What's my context? How did I get here? The when is, how is it supposed to behave? What does the user expect? And then is kind of the outcome stuff. And you can see this is starting to sound like a test. And so I think a lot of people make the mistake of turning the scenarios into tests. And I'll show you kind of what happens when you do that. So here's my hidden danger slip. It works if the projector is kind of washed out, because you can't really see the line working through the graphs. So I've done a lot of this BDD stuff. The nice thing was, at least for me, is that I did it wrong for a very long time. So first thing I did wrong. That's supposed to be red. First thing I did wrong was I focused on the tools. So when I first learned about BDD, the thing I learned about was called Cucumber. So you heard of Cucumber? So I said, Cucumber, sweet, that's a programming thing. I can use that, I'm a developer. And I kind of lost track of all the other stuff. But I had the tool stuff down. So focusing on the tools, we should avoid that. If you find yourself getting too obsessed with those, you know you're probably straying from proper BDD. Second one was treating the scenarios as tests. So I've got a couple examples of that in a little bit here, but I got to a point where I stopped collaborating so much with the product owner and writing the scenarios, and I started writing them on my own, and I started writing them for the purposes of my testing. And that was kind of sort of okay, except that over time my test suite got really big and really slow and really hard to maintain and all that stuff. The other one that I was also guilty of, that's really easy to do, is cargo culting. Is anyone familiar with this phrase? So I'll tell the fun story. So like in World War II, you had the Japanese and the Americans, and they're setting up these little bases in the South Pacific. And so there's people on these islands that are native, but they haven't never seen military before. So the military was there, and every once in a while an airplane would fly by and drop like a big cargo bundle of stuff, food and rations and whatever. And so when the war was over, obviously the Japanese and the Americans packed up, they went home, but the natives didn't understand how that whole thing worked. So they would dress up as soldiers and they would march, and they would build like fake landing strips, and they would build fake airplanes, because they thought that the way you got stuff to fall out of the sky was with this thing. They didn't understand how that worked. And so you'll see this a lot some example of someone doing something with BDD, and you don't know any better, so you just kind of take it, and you don't understand how it works. And that gets you into a lot of trouble. The last one, full stack abuse. So I mentioned that I had a test suite that was very slow and long running. So I had a test suite that tested probably like 95% of the entire application, but it took like almost an hour to run. That kind of violates the 10-minute build, right? If I ever wanted to make a change, it would take me at least an hour to run all the tests. And that was because it got really convenient for me to just write a test at this really high level that did all this black magic inside this black box that I couldn't really see into. And it turned out that it didn't really matter what the code looked like in there, because you could just do whatever you wanted. Because you put a bunch of stuff in over on this side, and it would spit out the right answer over here. And that turned into this like maintenance nightmare. Having to maintain that black box was too much to handle. So here's some examples. This is that first scenario, and this is kind of focusing on the tools. So it turns out that this tool I'm using, I can like tokenize these strings. So I can reuse this. I can say, given I'm a site manager instead, right? So if you show this to a product person, they're going to say, why is like division, that's not, like that's a real word. I don't have to put quotes around it. But maybe that's kind of okay. So you can see this is kind of going down this weird path where I'm kind of abusing the tool a bit. Here's one where I'm getting more into treating this thing like a test. Like my division has $100,000 in revenue, and then I should see $100,000 in the revenue total column. Now I'm talking about like seeing something on some page. What happens if revenue total column goes away? I have to go back and edit this test. That seems kind of weird. That's not about it. Behavior is not specific to this. Here's a good example of cargo culting. I think you'll find a lot. So I started writing this test, and I realized that I really want this thing. Like, I want to be a division manager because I need that context. And I don't really know how that works in the system. I don't know how to make that work. But I found another test that does this, and it ends, had that part in it, so I'll just take that, right? Because I can just reuse it. So my test doesn't really care that I work at this organization or that my manager is Laura or that, all that stuff. But I just wanted this thing, because I don't understand how this works. So I did that a lot. Copy and paste, copy and paste, copy and paste. And this one gets into like the full stack abuse stuff. I'm kind of lazy, and so I don't really want to write the scenario in such a way that it can apply to anything. But since I have a web app, I start talking about things like I'm logged in as Eric. I click on the reports link, maybe. I click on this link. I should see this button. So I'm getting all into this domain of like the web. But the behavior of my application doesn't matter if it's a web app or a mobile app or a desktop app or whatever. But now I've like encoded that in my scenario. And so if you ever show this, if you were to write this thing out and show this to like a product person or business analyst, I think you'd get one of these, like the what? That's certainly my experience whenever I try to show these things to people. And then I always have to get the rage face in here, but if you go back 2 months later and there's a defect for this scenario and you have to fix it, you're going to be this guy. Like I have kicked myself so many times writing those scenarios, and it's been the nightmare. So I'll leave you with a few kind of parting thoughts. I think we're over it. Is it 2 o'clock we're over? I'm already 5 minutes over. So first thing you want to do when you think about BDD is you want to try and do some discovery first. Like just ask yourself the things that, what are some things that you might not know? What are things that you think are true that you don't know how you know they're true, and all that good stuff. Just do some discovery. Think about the thing you wrote down in your piece of paper in that second column. And then the next thing you should do, once you've got the discovery part down and you're doing a very good job of collaborating, and you kind of have a good workflow with the product owner, then you can start doing some describing of these things, like writing down the features, using given, when, then. Once you've got to a point where the given, when, then stuff, and you're able to describe the scenario